When Swamiji moved to India in 2003, they took a house. He wanted to go back to Delhi, which was where he had been in 1962 when SRF took him out of India and took him out of SRF, and that whole chapter of his life, the idea of working for Master in India, that chapter closed until 2003, and he just, for him it was an unbroken stream. When he wrote a brochure to introduce himself and Ananda to India, he just picked it up where he'd left off in 1962, and then it was 2003, and he just went on. And you could see his own sense of it was that it was like one step that the foot was in the air, and then all those years had passed, and then he put the foot down again. The city had changed, so the house they ended up renting was in not a suburb, but a city close to Delhi called Gurgaon. And they had all these closed developments, essentially, with very nice homes in them, but the only people who came in and out were the people who lived there, so they were very, very quiet, wonderful place. Gurgaon means the Guru's village, and it was named after Dronacharya from the Mahabharata, which was a very nice relationship. So they rented this big 4- or 5-story house. Swami had the little apartment on the very top floor. Then there was a huge roof terrace, the way the houses are there. And he moved in November, and that first March 7th, first Mahasamadhi of Master in India, Swami going back, the whole work starting there, there was, it's very difficult to describe how intense the whole thing was, in a very beautiful way, but it was, there was so much of Swamiji invested in making this work for Master. And then here it was, his Mahasamadhi, and he sat on the roof terrace this way, and everybody was facing him. And as it happened, the moon rose behind him. So during the time that he was talking, which was already an astral experience, they watched I think the moon was full, at least it was very large, and it just kind of came up behind him the whole time he was speaking. I mean, there are moments in this plane where you are not on this plane. You're just somewhere else. You don't know where you are because you come back and life goes on as normal, but it's like it cracks the delusion. And even when it comes back together, it comes back together somewhere else. And whenever Swamiji would talk about Master's passing, it was so important for him to help us to understand that the Master doesn't leave, that his presence is so undefined by the physical body that whether he's in or out of it, from the point of view of the accessibility of his consciousness, there is no difference. And from the point of view of our discipleship, there is no difference. There are those who are born, as Swami described it in Master's life, to really take care of the Master, to cook for him, to sort of give him energy in a personal way, to just make it work for him. And many of the people who were left in charge of SRF as it happened, that group of women, Dayamata, Nandamata especially, were really there to help Master personally, Durga Mata to an extent. Swami said that Anandamata, whenever Master would speak, he would want her in the room. And he would always, when she would come in, he would visibly relax, is how Swami put it. And that was really her job. They got left with running the organization. It was not really their primary purpose in incarnating. And Dayamata herself describes her years with Master, she put it, I live in those years. And Swamiji's comment was, even though from a certain point of devotion, he said that's admirable. He said, we have to live in these years. We can't have our thought be always that if only things were different. You know, if only, if only, if only. Well, I think about the situation that we were in then, because we listened to Master Swamiji talking about Master. And the only one in the room who can actually see his living face is Swamiji. For all the rest of us, Swamiji's living presence is coming through the living presence that we're watching, which was Swami himself. And Swami talked about his own relationship to Master in a very interesting way. He said, because on one hand, you see, Swami was 22 when he came, and not quite 26 when Master died. Just less than 4 years he was there. And he was very young when he started, and he was very young when that time was over. And Master himself was not old. So his departing so quickly and so early in Swami's incarnation, and even Master had been promising, I believe for 3 years in a row, that he was going to go to India and he was going to take Swami with him. And there was that was such a powerful samskar for Swamiji, to be in India with Master. And, you know, it was, once again, every year that was canceled for some reason, and once again they were going to go, and then Master died, and all of that slipped away from him. And because Swamiji always had to present for us the proper attitude of discipleship, it was very rare when he would actually talk about what that experience was for him to lose Master so young. But he has used words like, you know, just inconsolable. Just the grief of it. It's such a paradox, because the freedom of spirit is there, but the mere freedom of spirit doesn't change the tenderness of the heart. It's something that you hear me talk about because I myself am trying to understand it. Swami was even talking about, in something I read, something he said, that even when he was expelled from SRF, which was such an intensely, almost unbearable pain for him, he said, on some deeper than conscious level, I knew it was the right thing and it had to happen. But even knowing that didn't make it less. And so he's always having to talk to us about how we have to carry on and what it really means to be a disciple, so that his own anguish is a truth, but not a relevant one. And so it still exists, but nonetheless, this is what we have to do now. And he talked about the fact that he had to come late in Master's life. He said if Swamiji's interest was in taking this magnificent message of self-realization and giving it to as many as would take it, Swamiji himself said, I like to believe that if I can just explain it clearly and simply enough, everyone will understand. And he said, I know that's not true. He says, but it serves me to believe it. And so that was his passion. Even as he said when he first read Autobiography of a Yogi and was coming across the country, even as he was going across the country just to see Master for the first time, his thought was, I have to tell everyone about this. And so he said if he'd come earlier in Master's life, it simply wasn't time. It wasn't the moment to go out and spread the message. In fact, he said all the different teachers virtually that all the different ministers and teachers, the men that Master sent out to spread his message, all, as Swami said, became enamored of their own selves, and they all drifted away. He said it wasn't the time for it to happen. Master had to plant the vibration very powerfully before it could be dispersed. But when Swamiji arrived, that was the moment. And as Swami said, as soon as Master saw in him his own desire to share this teaching, he said that's when Master started saying to him, you have a great work to do. It wasn't Master thinking, how can I use this man? It was Master looking at Swami and seeing who he was already. There was a very sweet interchange that I was remembering, where Swamiji was, there was a woman who was close to him, and she actually did many wonderful things for Ananda, but she also had an odd temperament and wasn't particularly apparently skillful in many ways. And it was sort of a joke about not really being able to cook and not really being able to sing and not really being so good at this or so good at that. And it was Swamiji often would tease us and make us laugh about things that we might also be inclined to take seriously if our orientation was different. So he teased this woman a lot about, and she would enter into it in a good-natured way, about her relative incompetence in inconsequential things. And then one day he noticed that she was sad. And he, what is making you sad? And she sort of lamented what had been humorous the day before was now making her sad. Swami looked at her so seriously. He said, if I had people around me only for what they could do, he said, I would be using them. He said, I would never think of using you. He said, I want you close to me because of who you are, in your spirit and in your heart. And so, Master looking at Swami, it wasn't that Master wanted to use Swami, it was that Swami wanted to serve. And as Swami said, it wouldn't have satisfied him to cook for Master or to rub his feet or take care of his clothes or many of the things that many of the women who incarnated to be close to him came to do. They were there just to literally to make it work for Master. As Swamiji said, you get a lot of your energy from inside, but it helps to also get it from others. They came to give Master energy so Master could go forward. But Swami had something completely else to do. His burning zeal was to carry the message. And so even Master's early demise, from Swami's point of view, the power had been given him. And the power was in him. And then for the rest of his life, without any more personal contact after those first 3.5 years, and then 10 years after that, he was separated from all his Guru Bhais, and he never had any peers after that. But he held it. He held it without wavering. Day after day, after day after day, in relative solitude, because even though he was surrounded by people and we all did our best, there was an enormous part of his reality that no one could understand but him. And now, I'm standing here on Swami's Moksha Day, and most of you, but not all of you, have at least met Swamiji. But there's a huge disparity among us. I mean, just all of us in different ways, in terms of how much that incarnation actually intersected with ours, and how interwoven our sense of him in his body is. It's some of us, like me, just have a lifetime of memories. I can't even begin to sort through it. There's just so much of it. Others just had one touch or even none. And so all that Swami said repeatedly to us about Master, that yes, there was a physical form, and there was a very definite vibration and personality that acted through and put so much into this world. We're listening to his voice, singing the songs that he himself wrote. We're listening to these stories of this amazing sensitivity he had and this loyal friendship that he gave. And all of that form has, in this extraordinarily mysterious way, just taken itself apart again. You know, I was thinking again about Swami's passing, just the stories that people told. His body was just diminishing, you know, so steadily that by the end it was a miracle that he could still move around. And on the very last day of his life, he wasn't really able to speak, but he was looking at his emails. He was sitting at the breakfast table. He was sort of following the routine, but his inability to speak was not self-evidently, it was not evident that he was about to die. He was just clearly very tired. And because those who were with him were accustomed to seeing him that way, the fact that he didn't bring his thoughts out into words was not that unusual. But then a shudder went through his whole body, sort of a spasm went through his whole body, just like that. And 15 minutes later he breathed his last. And really, he left when that happened. But the people who were with him were not quite able. And so they took him into his room and they tried to persuade him to breathe. So he breathed a little bit more. But really, it just went like that. And then it was over. Just the whole, that part of it. But his consciousness is a continuous ray, just as Master's consciousness is a continuous ray, just as the consciousness of Jesus is a continuous ray. I was speaking to someone I haven't seen in many months, and he asked me about my trip to Israel last October, and I was just talking about experiencing Jesus and all of that. And such a long time ago Jesus lived, but his consciousness is a continuous ray. Master was more recent, but there's nothing stops it. Swamiji was very recent, but nothing stops it. When a soul attains moksha, nothing stops it. But the real movement, the continuous movement of his consciousness, is us. And that's what Swamiji was always trying to get us to understand about Master. Don't look backwards to his empty chair. I mean, go to the room where he lived. Go to his childhood home. You know, cherish the relics of Master that we have on the altar here. But the real continuous energy is us, because it's the living expression that matters. And most of all, that living expression lives on through those who are in tune with him. When Swami sat there on March 7th in 2004 and told us of Master's living presence, and the moon came up behind him, there was no question. There was just no question but that Master was living in the room with us. And when Swamiji so often made choices to love and support us, that my favorite story in that book is the one that Sneha read, I think. You know, I came to Ananda early. I've been fortunate in my devotion, but in every other way my life has been tumultuous. Dozens of times, Swamiji counseled me in essentially the same way. You can do it. Don't give up. You can do it. I was the little sparrow falling to earth, and Swami always caught me and lifted me up again. There's more dramatic stories in that book, but I think that epitomizes Swami more than any of the others. Dozens of times he counseled me in the same way. The effect he had on me was like drops of water on a stone, carving out of the hard rock of my ego a receptive place for God's love. That's the living presence. Every time we remember now, as Master loved us, as Swami loved us, how can I now be their own instrument? We have before us, in the life of Swami, what we can become by that simple decision. All that Swamiji has done, as he himself said, and Navashan read for us at the end, all of it just goes the way Swami put it. I heard him say it today on a tape. Nothing that we do belongs to us. When we die, it just goes away from being ours. You know, the great writers, the great painters, the great musicians, the great saints, all that Swami did, it just exists now. There's no self to pull it. It's just there. It's all gone. That's why it's so easy to say, in the end, I only have one question. Because the only point of comparison for the disciple is as a disciple to the Guru. That's the only way Swami ever saw himself. That was his humility. Because compared to Master, he was always just a child. Remember Rajasi and Master? Rajasi, multi-millionaire, self-realized soul. Master called him my little one. Rajasi called himself your little boy. Swamiji always thought of himself next to Master as just a little boy. And after it was all done, just wanted to bring that heart to his Guru and say, all that matters to me is have I been a good disciple. The ray of the Master, Swamiji's ray, never stops, but it lives especially when we ourselves become a pure window. And in Swamiji, he shows us what we can become if we do that.